The moon hung low over Bayou St. Clair, its pale beams turning the dark water into a shimmering sheet of silver. Old cypress trees stood like silent sentinels, their twisted roots jutting out of black soil. A hush filled the air each night, broken only by the croaking of frogs and the rhythmic hum of insects. Yet the folks who lived near the bayou knew better than to wander too close after darkness fell. The elders had whispered tales of spirits lurking in every eddy, every swaying bough. Most dreaded the night when shadows danced at the edge of lantern light. Still, curiosity has always been a potent lure, even in the face of old magic lingering near the crossroads. Alphonse Dupont had grown up on these stories, handed down by his grandmother, who talked of the lower as if they were as real as the harvest. She would stare out at the moonlit swamp and mutter prayers under her breath, beads clacking in her hands as she warned him, "Never heed a midnight call at the crossroad. That's the hour the lower listens through the veil." Young Alphonse believed her, his dreams gleaming bright with the shimmer of possibility and the tingle of fear that such magic existed. But as the years passed and the raw desperation of poverty took hold, he began to wonder if there was a path to better fortune. The crossroad, with all its dark mysteries, beckoned. His grandmother passed on a sticky hot evening when Alphonse was 18. Through salt-streaked eyes, he stood by her grave in the sweltering August sun, feeling he'd lost not only his kin but the steadying force that kept him from straying down forbidden paths. In the decades that followed, he drifted around the bayou, taking on odd jobs, fishing for catfish, mending neighbors' fences, never finding a proper place to plant roots. Rumors swirled that he carried some strange knowledge. Egress, they said, the hidden script of the spirits. Though Alphonse never spoke of it, he let the townsfolk believe what they wished. Many nights, he would find himself fumbling with the battered old rosary his grandmother had given him, etched with her final warning never to bargain with the lower at midnight. But desperation is a hard tide to resist. One cloudless evening, Alphonse's young niece, Simone, fell violently ill. No doctor could pinpoint her affliction. Fever ravaged her, racing through her body, leaving her trembling and incoherent. She muttered things about shadows dancing near her bedside, about a tall, ominous figure in midnight attire beckoning her to the threshold. Alarmed, Alphonse travelled the length of the parish seeking cures, but the medicines were powerless against the unseen ailment. Each doctor raised their arms in defeat, condemning Simone to fate. With each day, she slipped closer toward a final breath, until Alphonse, in desperation, decided the old taboos might hold the only hope left. He remembered every detail his grandmother recounted, the crossroads beyond the cypress grove, the bewitching hour, and a small sacrifice of meaningful worth. Alphonse had a single keepsake that bound him to his grandmother's memory, her rosary. The beads had accompanied her through every prayer, every whispered hope. If there was something precious enough to catch the lower's notice, it was that. With a mind torn between fear and devotion, Alphonse set out for the taboo crossroad, guided by the relentless chirping of crickets and the glow of moonlight weaving through moss-laden branches. He arrived just as the clock struck midnight. The path split in 4 directions, each leading deeper into the swamp. The ground at the center of the crossing looked charred, as though touched by fire in years long past. A hush fell around him, and for a moment he questioned whether the stories were mere superstition. Then the wind stirred suddenly, carrying the scent of incense and an electric edge that lifted the hairs on his arm. Alphonse breathed in and stepped to the heart of the crossroad. Removing the rosary from his pocket, he gripped it tightly, remembering the warmth of his grandmother's hand when she first placed it there. His voice quavered as he spoke ancient words, calling for guidance, for intervention, for mercy. A swirl of wind whipped around him, raising a subtle dust that glowed faintly under the moonlight, forming strange shapes before dissolving into the night. Just when Alphonse thought no spirit had heeded his plea, a quiet, measured footstep broke the silence. Emerging from the farthest corner of darkness stood a figure dressed in a worn tailcoat. His top hat cast a long shadow across the ground. The figure's eyes glinted behind a swath of darkness, and when he finally came close enough, Alphonse saw that uncanny half-grin painted on his face. At first, Alphonse believed it might be Papa Legba, the lower, rumoured to guard doorways and thresholds. But something in that twisted smile and the heavy, cloying smell of grave dirt suggested otherwise. This was another force entirely, one that had stepped through the veil, lured by desperation and the potent magnet of a cherished heirloom. Alphonse's heart pounded as the figure gestured toward the rosary in his hand. A silent exchange passed between them. Questions, bargains, unspoken demands. Alphonse fell to one knee, raising the relic in both palms, trembling. His voice sounded distant to his own ears as he uttered his request. "My niece is dying, hear me, spare her." He could scarcely get the words out. Fear tightening his throat, the wind picked up again, swirling leaves around his feet. An eerie hush claimed the crossroads. The figure extended a slender hand. A single bony finger ran across the beads, stopping at the crucifix. Even in that brief moment, Alphonse felt the air grow colder. A strange, echoing sound, like whispered chanting, formed on the breeze. Without warning, the figure closed its hand over Alphonse's, enveloping the rosary and Alphonse's fingers in a grip of iron. Everything went black. When Alphonse next opened his eyes, he was alone in the middle of the crossroads. Lying on his back, the moon was nearing the edge of the horizon. Birds had begun to chirp. The rosary was gone, leaving behind only an empty circle imprinted in the dust. Suppressing a frantic sense of loss, Alphonse hurried away, praying silently into the thinning darkness. The news the next morning struck a chord of hope in his heart. Simone's fever had subsided. She woke up coherent, asking for water. Her face no longer bewildered. Doctors considered it a miracle. Neighbours came to see her recover. Relief soared in Alphonse's spirit. He felt gratitude, but also a gnawing dread. He had made no oath in words, but an exchange had taken place at that crossroad. The lower had seized something precious in return, and who knew what further demands would manifest? For a time, the bayou seemed calm. Simone grew stronger by the hour. Alphonse went back to daily chores, fishing before dawn, collecting driftwood by dusk. But the nights brought unsettling dreams, dark shapes gliding through the swamp, a soft voice humming a funeral dirge. Then came the glimpses, shadows traipsing just outside the lamplight, flickering behind old cypress stumps. One evening, a neighbour named Claudine reported seeing a tall figure with a top hat rapping on her window at midnight. She swore she heard laughter drifting away as she built up her nerve to investigate. Soon, anxious whispers circulated. The bayou is stirring again with old spirits. Superstition reawakened, and Alphonse felt the weight of those rumours like cinder blocks on his chest. He alone knew the crossroads were no longer dormant. Each midnight that followed saw spectral lights winding through the swamp. The hush of frogs was replaced by hollow moans that came from nowhere. Folks in the small settlement near Bayou St. Clair found footprints traced in soot across their doorsteps, and it wasn't long before illness and misfortune fell upon them in a wave. Chickens stopped laying. Storms ravaged fishing lines. Children woke screaming from nightmares of a masked figure. The devout placed crosses above their doorways, hoping to ward off the creeping doom. Alphonse recognized the echoes of an unfinished bargain. Aloha had come, awakened by his call and hungry for more than a single treasured relic. Guilt weighed on him. He carried it into sleepless nights, haunted by images of the crossroad. During the day, he visited his niece's bedside. She was healthy now, but often wore a worried frown whenever she spotted a shape moving at the edge of her vision. Alphonse tried comforting her, telling stories of the good Loa who guide and guard. But her eyes wandered toward the window each time a breeze stirred, as if expecting some dark entity to appear. Determined to end this haunting, he sought guidance from Madame Lisette. an elderly mambo rumoured to commune with the spirits. Madame Lisette lived in a rickety shack that leaned precariously over the water's edge. Charms and bottles hung from the rafters. The air inside was thick with incense, smoke curling around shelves of oddities, jarred herbs, curious stones, and carved trinkets that evoked a sense of power. With a slight stoop and cane, she welcomed Alphonse into her sanctum. She listened intently as he explained everything in hushed tones. Though her gaze softened at the mention of Simon's illness, a shadow of fear crossed her face when he described the crossroads. "You offered a precious thing to one who was not Papa Legba," she said gravely, her voice like dry reeds. "There's no telling which lower you released. These pacts can unearth old grudges, angered spirits. They feed on the vulnerability that lingers in desperate hearts." Alphonse lowered his head in shame, recalling his grandmother's warnings. "What must I do?" he asked. "How do I stop it?" Madame Lisette tapped her cane on the warped floorboards. "The spirit has a hold on your offering, and you, in turn, are responsible for the cost. There's only one way. You must invite the shadow back to the crossroads. Only then can you renounce the pact. But you'll need more than just a sacrifice this time. This lower won't leave empty-handed." The next day, she set Alphonse to gather items for a binding ritual, a black rooster for sacrifice, specific herbs to ward off dark energies, a bottle of rum, and a special veve drawn in chalk dust that would anchor the spirit so it could not escape. With each step, Alphonse felt the weight of his wrongdoing. He plucked the black rooster from a nearby farm at night, purchased the rum from a travelling vendor, and ventured into the swamp for the bitter herbs at dusk. He felt the eyes of hidden watchers all along the glades, fleeting movements in the corner of his vision. Twice he saw footprints trailing him, only to vanish when he spun around. Midnight approached with swift inevitability. Alphonse found himself retracing the same path to the cursed crossroad. This time, Madame Lisette followed. Her eyes shone with dark knowledge. By the glow of lantern light, they drew a large VV in the dust at the crossroads, a symmetrical pattern of walls and lines, meant to capture the spirit as if in a snare. Next, they placed the black rooster, painting its beak with white chalk as part of the ritual. The bottle of rum was uncorked and set beside them. Recalling old incantations, Madame Lisette took the lead, chanting words that made the air tremble. Soon, a stifling stillness claimed the place. The night insects silenced, as if commanded by a higher force. The moon overhead peered through swathes of driftwood-like clouds, casting a pale glow onto the veve. Then the wind picked up, swirling dust in unnatural spirals. Madame Lisette's chants rose in intensity, her voice echoing across the swamp. All at once, the top-hatted figure emerged from behind a cypress trunk, vapor-like at first, then solidifying. Alphonse's breath caught at the malevolent presence. The figure's grin shone through the lantern light, revealing a hungry expression that sent chills down Alphonse's spine. As it stepped toward the veve, Madame Lisette's chanting grew louder, and for a moment the figure hesitated, yet its foot crossed the boundary with unnatural confidence, as though no line of chalk would restrain it fully. The old Mambo locked eyes with the entity. "We name you," she declared. "You took the child's fate in your hands. You must return what you owe." The figure only smirked, a silent challenge. Alphonse's heart hammered. He held the black rooster in trembling hands, knowing the sacrifice was part of the ritual. In these traditions, blood might seal or break a bond. Carefully, Alphonse placed the rooster at the center of the veve. With a deep breath, he enacted the old rite, letting crimson drops spatter across the bird's throat, letting crimson drops spatter across the chalk lines. In that moment, he felt an energy surge through the circle. A gust of wind whipped up, extinguishing the lantern's flame. Darkness fell, broken only by the moon's faint silver glow. The figure vanished, then reappeared at the circle's edge, its eyes burning with suppressed fury. Madame Lisette extended her arms, chanting louder. The powdered herbs and rum bottle began to rattle, as though invisible hands shook them. The figure made a swift movement, and suddenly Alphonse felt a force crash into him. Stumbling backward, he fought to keep his footing. Fear constricted his throat, but he remembered Simone's innocent face and clung to the desperation that had led him here. Summoning his courage, he recited the words Madame Lisette had taught him. "We renounce your hold. Return to the place from whence you came." Each syllable resounded with an otherworldly tension, as if the entire swamp was straining to hear. A strange cry split the night. The top-hatted entity threw back its head, a brittle laughter echoing through the cypress trees. Slowly, the roiling shadows at its feet began to coalesce, forming ghostly shapes. They were silhouettes of twisted faces and longing eyes, restless souls caught between worlds. They encircled Alphonse and Madame Le, reaching out with ephemeral hands, lamenting in voiceless shrieks. Alphonse felt panic rising. This had to be the restless shadows the elders had warned about. Their presence seemed to sap his strength with every second. Madame Lisette shouted above the storm of wailing spectres, "Hold steady! Keep chanting!" Alphonse clenched his fists. Through dry lips he forced out the renunciation again, straining to speak over the turmoil. The chalk lines flickered with faint light, as if awakened by the sacrificial blood, forging a boundary that pinned the figure in place. Bit by excruciating bit, the swirling shadows thinned. The echoes of their mourning receding, the figure's grin slackened, replaced by a snarl of anger. Alphonse could sense its resolve fluctuating, the binding lines taking effect. Yet the lower was not finished. It locked its gaze on Alphonse, eyes full of ancient cunning. With a trembling hand, Alphonse reached inside his shirt, intending to produce a final offering or prayer. But there was nothing left. The rosary was long gone, and he had no other relic to wield. The figure advanced, pushing against the boundary. Madame Lisette stumbled, her voice faltering. The circle threatened to break. In that instant, an echo of his grandmother's voice whispered in Alphonse's mind, "Faith is not in the object, but in the devotion." Clinging to that memory, he drew a ragged breath and placed his hand against the center of his chest. He poured all his remorse, fear, and love for Simone into a single wordless prayer, imagining a shield forming around him and the mambo. The top-hatted spirit pressed hard against the boundary, the crack forming in the shimmer of moonlight. But Alphonse refused to let it break. He roared, not with anger, but with a desperation that transcended language. The luminous lines of the vivi flared. Madame Lisette resumed her chanting in rhythmic bursts. The swirling darkness slowed its churn, as though it were losing the strength to press forward. Suddenly, the entity's form collapsed into shadow, slipping to the ground like black water. The collected darkness slithered into the center of the veve, swirling around the sacrificed rooster before spiraling upward in a funnel of swirling dust. A single tense moment stretched before the funnel split open with a sharp thunderclap. Then silence descended, thick and absolute. The shapes were gone, replaced by the black stains along the chalk lines and the metallic tang of blood lingering in the humid night air. For what felt like a lifetime, Alphonse and Madame Lisette remained kneeling, breaths ragged, hearts pounding. Gradually, the typical nighttime sounds returned. Frogs croaking, crickets chirping, the drip of water from a nearby swamp fern. The oppressive weight had lifted, and though unspoken relief filled Alphonse, sorrow gnawed that such a price had been paid. The old mambo wearily met his eyes. "You have undone this terror," she said, her voice rasping. "But the spirits never forget a bargain. Remember what has transpired here." Alphonse helped her to her feet, and their gazes settled on the shattered remnants of the ritual. The black rooster lay silent, sacrificed for a debt that nearly claimed the entire bayou. The dusty vive, smeared with blood and footprints, now lay inert. Somewhere in the night breeze, a faint echo of laughter drifted. Alphonse glanced around, unable to see anything beyond the thin sheen of mist rolling through. He shuddered. Perhaps the entity would never be entirely gone, only subdued for a time. The Loa's footprints in the mortal realm left a lasting impression. They left the crossroads before dawn, the first tendrils of sunlight creeping over distant treetops. Alphonse escorted Madame Lisette home, where she collapsed onto her rocking chair. With a final warning, she reminded him that if ever again he felt the pull of desperation, he must recall that night and the cost paid. He thanked her, handing her the last of the rum they had used for the ritual, sealing a silent pledge to respect the boundaries between worlds. Upon returning to Simone's bedside, Alphonse found her sleeping peacefully. No longer did a dark shadow hover at her window. The hush of morning sunlight cast across her blankets, painting a moment of solace. He sighed, exhausted, yet relieved. Placing a gentle kiss on her forehead, he wondered what fresh burden she might bear for this near brush with darkness. She stirred awake and asked if the fever had truly left forever. Alphonse nodded, offering a small smile he barely felt. There had been a cost. Old traditions had demanded restitution. In the days that followed, the bayou's ailments gradually lifted. Chickens began laying eggs again. The fish returned to the waters, and children ceased waking from terrible nightmares. Yet there lingered a quiet caution among the townspeople. They sensed something had shifted in the ether, as though the boundary between the living and the shadows was thinner than before. Whenever someone mentioned the crossroad, hushed whispers and uneasy glances passed about. And if one listened close at midnight, subtle echoes of low chanting still rose from the cypress groves, as if the earth remembered every footstep of that dreadful night. Alphonse took to wearing a simple string of beads, perhaps as a reminder of the rosary now lost beyond mortal grasp. Some nights he stood on his porch under a canopy of stars, watching the dim glow of the swamp. He would close his eyes, recalling a time when fear drove him to open that forbidden door. The lesson was seared in him now. Attempts to harness the old hungry magic come with profound risks. One evening, Simone, fully recovered, joined him on the porch. She rested her head on his shoulder and whispered her thanks for saving her life. Alphonse hugged her close, feeling an upwelling of gratitude and fierce protectiveness. But he also knew that the heritage of the bayou was no bedtime story to be taken lightly. Sometimes, the only way to honor the old magic is to let it lie, unroused, in the silent places between the cypress stumps, never again to be tempted for mortal gain. He never stepped near that crossroad at midnight. Others might wonder or question, but Alphonse would only shake his head, reminding them that some doors, once opened, let in more than one can handle. The Loa weren't malicious by nature, but they demanded respect, tribute, and caution. Whether benevolent or terrifying, their power permeated the very bones of the swamp, and every rustle of leaves at night seemed to whisper their message. In the thick bayou air, the line between this world and the unknown remains perilously thin.